This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with Los Angeles County Museum of Art curator Diva Zumaya about the new exhibit, The World Made Wondrous, the Dutch Collector's Cabinet and the Politics of Possession, on display now through March 3rd of next year. Zumaya, who is the Assistant Curator of European Painting and Sculpture at LACMA, has brought together over 300 objects for the exhibit, including paintings, prints, sculptures, precious stones, shells, and taxidermy, in order to recreate a fictive 17th century Dutch collector's cabinet. The result is a dialogue about the political and colonial histories of European collecting practices in the 17th century, which highlights problematic policies, beliefs, and visual representations. And now, a conversation about the politics of possession with curator Diva Zumaya. Diva Zumaya, thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Diva, you're the Assistant Curator in the Department of European Painting and Sculpture at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And I wanted to talk to you about an exhibit coming up, The World Made Wondrous, the Dutch Collector's Cabinet and the Politics of Possession, September 17th to March 3rd there at LACMA. From the title, I wasn't sure exactly what to expect when learning about the exhibit, but after learning more about the specifics of the exhibit, it's obvious you've provided a really interesting lens through which to view this work. And I guess the real question for you is, like, where do you even start to describe this exhibit? I mean, is it a history lesson? I mean, where do you start?
Thanks for having me, Craig, and thank you for your interest in the show. It is a 17th century Dutch collector's cabinet, which some people may know through the term I'm choosing not to use, Cabinet of Curiosities. It's probably a little bit better known. But this type of collection, I'm kind of assembling a fictional version of. And it's a collection that had its origins in the 16th and 17th century across Europe, but I'm looking at the Dutch 17th century in particular. And in these types of collections, they had art, natural specimens, so things we would traditionally see as art, quote unquote, like paintings, but then also like a lizard or a reptile or, a brain in a jar. I don't have any brains, but in this show, but just as an example. And so that's the type of collection I'm assembling. So that's kind of, I have to start by saying what it is, but then why? Why am I doing this? And I'm not just doing it to celebrate them or say they were great per se, although they are, of course, visually fascinating to learn about and see and encounter. But I'm specifically doing this to criticize the early collecting history of European museums, and to which many American museums are all indebted, and especially the Encyclopedic Museum. And this type of collection is what gave birth and evolved into the museum. So that's why I'm kind of looking back at it and trying to pick it apart, and so especially look at how they were political and colonial devices in the period in which they were assembled.
I used to teach art history, and when I would explain exactly what emerged from this period, I would always be speaking about how there was this newfound wealth, and that in the art world and art history, you just follow the money, right? And, where the church was the entity that was paying for all the art, now there's this newfound wealth. They were doing the acquiring, and what were they looking for? I don't think I ever got below that level of where was the money coming from? How were they acquiring that wealth? You talk about the Netherlands in terms of a strategic geography, in terms of a gateway to Europe, but in terms of exactly what was coming, the mechanisms for how that wealth was being garnered, and how they were judging what was considered a curiosity and what was given value and what wasn't. Those are all really interesting things that I've never really spent a lot of time picking apart. So, maybe you could help give us a little bit of background on what was the VOC and what was the WIC.
So the VOC is the Dutch acronym for the Dutch East India Company. And the WIC is the Dutch acronym for the Dutch West India Company. So the East India Company was essentially the first corporation, and it was the first corporation to go around the world establishing monopolies on trade goods and conducting global trade on behalf of a government. So it was, at the same time, it was governmentally like licensed. It was also its own private company with shareholders and structured very much like the companies we know today. But it was also given the government gave them the license to wage war, to enslave people, to establish colonies on indigenous land through force and violence or whatever means necessary, essentially. So you get all kinds of goods coming in through both of these companies, the West India Company being based in the Atlantic world and the East India Company being based in the Indian Ocean world. With its headquarters in Batavia, which is now Jakarta in Indonesia. But yeah, you get all kinds of different goods coming in through like more, I guess we could say, democratic forms of trade, like for instance, Chinese porcelain coming in through the East India Company. But then you get goods like nutmeg or spices coming in through really violent colonial means. And the difference between how they bring in all these different goods and which goods are valued and which ones the Dutch really want is an interesting question, one that I try to explore in the publication and through the show.
It's a really interesting conversation. It's a rather dark conversation that has a lot of religious undertones. This is a period where the Dutch aren't Catholic. They're Dutch Reformed Church, Calvinist, and part of their worldview was kind of based around a European-centric hierarchy of man. Can you talk more about how they viewed people groups that were on the outside and how they made determinations on whether they respected them as even mankind or not?
Yeah. So it's a really fascinating time. And of course, the Netherlands is actually quite diverse in terms of its religions, and there's still a huge amount of Catholics present. However, the Calvinists kind of are the ruling class. So they're the people with the wealth, the people making the decisions, writing the history. And for the most part, they're the people sailing the ships of the VOC and the WIC. So they're the people who are doing this colonialism for the most part. Yeah, it's really fascinating to look at how Calvinism, this really particular form of Protestantism that's popular amongst this class, predominates in this ideology, which a fancy word for it is anthropocentrism, but essentially it means that they put man at the top of a pyramid and they put plants and animals and all their forms of life below. And it's quite literally a ranking. Not all plants are created equal, and it's all judged by how proximate you are to humans. And so you get this kind of ordering and categorizing of nature, which has its roots in antiquity and has its roots in the Bible. But Calvinists actually take it up as a spiritual pursuit. And of course, there's something kind of beautiful about that on the one hand, where they're looking at God's creation. If you're religious, right, you might still think this way of looking at like a bouquet of flowers as sign of the diversity of God's creation and the abundance, right? But then, as you mentioned, it takes kind of a dark turn when people start looking at people as not belonging to humanity and instead plug somewhere else along this ladder, right? And sometimes the reasons why people change status in the eyes of the Dutch or Europeans writ large is that it's really a political and economic convenience. For instance, in the 17th century, we see a shift around Blackness and the discussion of enslaved peoples being more and more exclusively thought of as Black Africans. And they do a lot of sort of ideological gymnastics to kind of justify this. It's horrific. But in the end, they kind of invent the notion of Blackness. They invent the notion of race in order to and categorize these people as less than people or lower down this ranking in order to justify something that's tremendously economically beneficial to them. So we see this happen in conjunction with political and economic needs, I think, quite a lot. But it's been happening since across the Middle Ages. You get all kinds of medieval theological authors writing about monstrous races and people from, supposed monstrous peoples who are kind of human but not. So we get this kind of a tradition that's been happening in Europe for 1,000 years at this point, but then we see it really overlay with colonial political interests.
It's interesting what criteria they were using to try to discern between what people groups were monstrous or barbaric versus those that might be considered just a lower form of humanity. And, for example, there were indigenous cultures that were not respected and open to slavery, but they sort of had some level of respect for South Asia and China. But even then, no one was at the top of the heap like their European-centric vision that they had.
Right, right.
It almost seemed like they were looking at what items these people had to trade as being some reflection of their place in society.
Yeah, exactly. I think so. And I tried to kind of argue that in the book and talk about this relationship between the goods people had that they produced and how Europeans evaluated those in tandem with the people themselves. But yeah, it's really fascinating. And sometimes it does feel totally arbitrary. From one indigenous group to the next, across the world, you get completely different ideologies around them. And the Europeans at this time, I think in the early modern period, it's not a generalization to say that they are obsessed with making. They're obsessed with craftsmanship and high quality craftsmanship and these kinds of ideas. So I think they do go into places saying, okay, what do you have for us? And what do you make? And for instance, it's a fascinating case study about featherwork in Brazil and in the Americas in general, because Europeans are obsessed with this featherwork, but they look at it from a really connoisseurial standpoint, that how well it's made, which it is. It's made incredibly well. But they kind of miss the point about the spiritual use of these garments or the meaning of birds, and they don't really care about that, right? They care about these feathers are very well stitched, and so they put a little bit of like a teaspoon of praise on the people who make those for making them well, but that's not enough to save their status as humans or not. In the end, some of those folks do get subjugated and enslaved, so the economic interest went out.
It wasn't just the Dutch at this time. I mean, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the British, there was a lot of trade going on. And when we look at the numbers of slave trade, the Dutch are responsible for their share of that. This is a pretty dark period when we think about exactly how our interconnected world was developing. There was a bit of a colonial power grab going on at that time. I thought it was interesting. You mentioned in the literature for the show about how, I guess, with this Calvinist ideal of predestination, they were less concerned with proselytizing or being missionaries like the Catholics were.
Right.
And that actually opened up some places like Japan, which were closed off to, Spain, Portugal, and the Catholics that were looking at extending these trade routes there.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating how each version of colonialism that these different European entities are undertaking looks quite different and has kind of different priorities. Of course, in the end, it all comes down to the economic benefit back to the motherland, the home country, I think across the board. But yeah, and for Spain and Portugal, you do get this sort of gloss, this kind of thing of conversion and saving people and winning, masses of people to the true faith, to Catholicism. Whether or not people can argue about whether or not that was like the number one motive or, it's probably economics, but that was definitely at play. And then you get the Dutch Protestant colonialism, which is much more economically motivated, of course, without something else coming into play. And like you said, that benefited them in certain cases because Japan was not interested in being converted any longer. The Portuguese kind of overstayed their welcome and it didn't go well with them for that reason. So it won their favor, and then other times, it kind of allowed them, I think, to more quickly write off certain groups of people as inhuman, or we can just massacre this island, right? And it's there's less at stake in terms of converting everyone. So it's interesting because a lot of times in my field, the less religious aspects, religious nature of Dutch colonialism has been used to cast it as somehow less bad than Spanish or Portuguese colonialism, or I don't know. It's ridiculous to even say, but it's not. It's just different. And there was definitely times where it worked in their favor and times where it had really dark consequences.
I know that you have created an audio guide that goes along with the exhibit in lieu of some of the wall text. I was wondering if you might be able to tell us about some of those contemporary voices you've included that help provide context and perspective.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. I'm really, it was a lot of work, and I'm really passionate about what we were able to accomplish with the audio guide, where we brought together 18 different speakers. And we did so because so often what's focused on in this kind of topic is the collector and these European wealthy men and women and what they wanted or didn't want, or kind of their tastes and their story. And I really wanted to sideline that as much as possible. Of course, I still address it in the publication, but in the in-gallery experience, I wanted to see what other kind of narratives we could draw out. So we have contemporary artists. We have a lot of scientists, environmental historians. I'm really excited about the partnership we developed with the Natural History Museum. So I learned so much from Aaron Celestian in mineral sciences, Jan Vendetti in malacology, for example. I learned so much about shells and gems and
Rhinoceros.
And the rhinoceros from Casey Bell there. So I had so much to learn from my colleagues there. The contemporary artists were also really exciting to work with. And some of their work is in the show as well. So it's fantastic to have their voices overlaid in the exhibition.
You mentioned the Natural History Museum, and I thought that was another thing that struck me in the literature accompanying the show is how in the sorting and classification, I mean, there was so much of what was going on during this time that was classifying. And in that classification, certain cultures wound up getting relegated to natural history museums, which is just odd. You even referred to one particular installation at a fair, which was pretty much a people zoo. Of course, that happened over centuries, but the roots of that classifying, are in these cabinets.
Exactly. Yeah. The roots of this categorization process are in the earliest collectors' cabinets already. It's sort of an ideology as a process. But then the actual formation of museums and then their separation into these distinct fields takes place more in the 18th and 19th centuries. But then you have all this ideology already in place to justify why you're putting what in which museum. And as you say, there's really from the start, actually, human beings are collected in the collector's cabinet, quote unquote, alongside their body parts. It gets really disturbing. Of course, things I could never have in my show or even gesture towards, right? But anatomical specimens that are locally collected are there, but then also body parts collected in a really colonial kind of gross, very gross way. And human beings are made to come back. Indigenous people from the Americas are made to come to, like, for instance, royal collections. Sometimes they're made to reenact, do indigenous native stuff that they do and as a performance. It's interesting. You can talk about the agency of those people as well and kind of make it more nuanced. But when you get down to it, there is this impulse to collect everything, not just the crabs and the shells, but human beings, and to categorize them. And that continues well over the centuries. As you said, there's this concept called human zoos, which is a pretty grotesque term, but it has a whole Wikipedia page, check it out. And people of these cultures, indigenous and African peoples, oftentimes were considered exhibitable, like zoo animals, because that's a really clear way of communicating these people are less human than we are. And that continued until the 50s. In some World's Fairs. So, and of course we have these people's, ancestors, which should be repatriated in some cases, most cases, and their body parts in natural history museums very often still, and in ethnographic museums, as they're often called. And their cultural products, their art, right, is in natural history museums. And that's something I always found so fascinating. And I've kind of understood more through my research on this show, that, why we consider something art, high art, quote unquote, and not, ethnographic. It is really comes down to these types of racist categorizing efforts.
One of the people on one of the audio guides had an interesting quote, and they said, they take what they don't know to build what they do know. And maybe we can describe some of the pieces in the exhibit. Some of those pieces, it's obvious that the objects aren't authentic to the society that they're coming from. It's almost like they've been commissioned for this European audience.
Yeah, and that quote was from Raquel Tupinamba, who's a fantastic indigenous leader of the Tupinamba people in the Amazon, the Tapajós River, and was absolutely fantastic. And I thought it was great that she turned things on their head and was talking about the European gaze is exotic and weird to her. And she talked about, the way in which they're kind of plugging things into their existing frameworks. They're kind of taking things that they like or they already value and plugging it into existing European frameworks of knowledge. But to get to your point about kind of commissions or things that are produced for the European market, you do see that a lot with lacquerware and with porcelain. That's something that's really interesting to me. I don't have Brazilian featherwork in the show for many reasons, but there are really interesting examples of porcelain that would never have been used in China, or most likely would not have been. And you have it taking all these new strange forms and shapes for European desires, right? Like a Genever bottle out of Chinese porcelain essentially is in the show. A pair of bottles that essentially is designed after European gin and brandy liquor bottles. And I'm just obsessed with them because they have this really fascinating form, and their shape and the way they were constructed is all related to this new market that they were made for. And so Europeans didn't hesitate to put in special orders, like, can you make this in your material, but in a form that we want? So you get really interesting cases with porcelain for sure.
Were all of the objects from LACMA's collection, or are these objects that were in the basement?
About 170 or so objects in the show were from LACMA's permanent collection, and I'm lucky that I'm, of course, at an encyclopedic, quote unquote, museum with a global collection, so I could work with almost every other department at the museum in order to make the show global appropriately to the collector's cabinet. And then I have a group of, I think, 11 or so lenders. I could be, let's just say, I have a large group of lenders as well for things like maps and books from the Getty Research Institute, things that we don't collect, scientific instruments from the Adler Planetarium, things that were important to have in the cabinet, but that we don't have anything like. And of course, the Natural History Museum was a major partner, filling out things like, the taxidermy and the shells and the gems, and they've been incredibly generous.
The show reminds me of an exhibit I saw at the Met last year called Fictions of Emancipation, where the Met was addressing issues of problematic depictions in the collection sort of head on. I mean, can you talk about creating a dialogue around problematic objects rather than just keeping them locked away?
Yeah. I mean, I guess in a way, this whole show is a problematic topic as well, that I'm trying to create a dialogue around. But there are objects within it as well where I think that's taking place. We have a really fascinating tapestry from the 15th century that was in the Hearst collection, and it has a caricatured figure of a Black person on it. And this is something that, to my knowledge, hasn't really been dug into, but it's been fascinating to research and think about why this representation is there. What does that mean? It's something that gets really, really caricatured and out of hand in like the 18th and 19th century, say in porcelain, right? But to think about it in the 15th century already being present is so interesting. So it is, and that's I'd say a fairly mild example. Of course, there's images from the period, and also in maps and books I have in the show, there's some pretty bad imagery of the continents in which you see Africa imaged in a pretty racist way already. Again, but I think what's so interesting to talk about and why they should be displayed with the appropriate context information is that it's fascinating to look at things that we think of as racist stereotypes in the more modern period and to see that they're already present in the 15th, 16th, 17th century. And to say, okay, well, what did it mean then? How did it evolve? How did this conception, these racist ideas overlay with political, changes? And I think it's really important because I'm really passionate about drawing a straight line between the early modern, meaning the 1400 through 1700, and now. And I think it's important to see how long these ideas have been around and how many forms they've taken.
Well, I mean, I believe there was at least one landscape painting that made a plantation look like a tropical resort like White Lotus or something, right?
It's a great way to put it. Yeah, transpost.
Do you think that providing a mechanism for analyzing the Dutch, does it allow the leap for people to turn a critical eye on themselves, on our own history, or even on our own contemporary culture?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've seen so much in the United States recently, how much is at stake in how we talk about the 17th century and this history in the United States, especially in the American history context, like with the 1619 Project, right? And all these really rigorous scholarly texts being labeled critical race theory, which of course is not like a bad word or anything, but we've seen this become a hot button issue. But it's fascinating because this is just history, right? This is just stuff that happened. And so telling the 17th century history in a really accurate way and talking about enslavement has so many implications for the United States, and also in quite a literal way, because of course the Dutch came to America, right? They're part of the colonial founders of this country. So the history is very interconnected in terms of the Atlantic world. Their colony in Brazil also served as a model for what the British would do in the Americas and the Caribbean. So there's a really direct one-to-one relationship historically between what the Dutch were doing and then the British to follow. But I think I can't overstate enough how important it is that we, reflect on the history of slavery, the history of colonialism, and how many of those structures have never ceased. We're also talking about the 17th century in terms of the dawn of capitalism more and more, and how all of these structures are interconnected. And so it's really important to look at how things never stopped. There's no like colonialism end date. Things just sort of took different forms.
My understanding is that you have some contemporary work in the show to provide contrast or, a dialogue between the contemporary and, this 17th century work. Can you talk a little bit about what those dialogues look like?
Yeah. There's only 4, so I think I can briefly talk about them.
Sure.
And I didn't want so much that it would overwhelm, the historical context, but it was important to me to also visualize this criticality that's going on, the critical dialogue, to kind of interrupt historicity of the show that's otherwise, kind of trying to recreate something historical in a way. So we have an incredible work by LA-based artist Todd Gray, which really specifically addresses the Atlantic trade in enslaved peoples and the legacy of this colonial mindset and this colonial exchange across the Atlantic. And that's really visually dynamic. We also have a work I'm really excited that we acquired for the collection called The Last Forest by Weirda Sodoma, who's a Brazilian indigenous trans artist. And they are an incredible up-and-coming kind of emerging artist who works on Amazonian conservation, and they take on this spirit called Weirda, who's a tree essentially, and this tree that walks, this tree that's embodied. They do performances and stage photos and photo series that kind of communicate the living, breathing nature of Mother Earth and of the Brazilian rainforests. And I loved the contrast of their work, really making the deforestation of the Amazon about these murder of these living beings, juxtaposed with Franz Poss, who you just mentioned, makes the Brazilian colony look like a resort, right? And it really objectifies the nature there for European consumers. There's also a work by Dutch artist Setable Malochwa, who's a really fantastic, important artist doing important work to dissect Dutch colonial histories. And she does these fantastic photo collages based in historical research, dissecting and drawing out, the colonial history and the violent histories underneath images like still life, for example. And then finally, we have a work by Jennifer Ling Datchuk, who is a Chinese-American ceramic-based artist based in Arizona. And she really her work does a great job at enlivening and complicating the Chinese porcelain section, because her works are porcelain, but they're kind of dealing with Chinese-American identity and femininity and womanhood and all these different personal histories. And so I think it's a really beautiful a suite of interventions, if you will, or conversations.
Like we mentioned earlier, a lot of the pieces in the exhibit can be problematic. They are problematic. But are there a couple of pieces that you really found captured your imagination or your interest? I mean, were there pieces that you found to include that really captivated you?
Yeah. No, I can share a few choices for sure. I mean, one of my first thoughts was the shells. We have a group of 12 shells from the Malacology department of the Natural History Museum, and I learned so much about them. And of course, there's a shell collecting craze in the 17th century Dutch Republic, where people are these wealthy men are assembling these shell collections, and to them they mean all these different things about spirituality and God's divine order, and they have these contemplative exercises you can do around them. So they have this whole other set of meanings for these Dutch guys. But then on the other hand, here I am learning from this amazing malacologist, Jan Vendetti, about them as mollusks. And the fact alone that she referred to them as mollusks kind of blew my mind, because I'm so used to looking at shells as just a decorative art material. And I'm like, oh wait, no, they're animals. They're living mollusks at one point that had to be killed for this. So it was really interesting to learn about the mollusks as animals. Really fascinating. I kind of was enamored by that. And then I'd say I'm also like a Chinese porcelain super fan now. I'm also obsessed. Same with lacquerware. There's these, immense bodies of scholarship and knowledge and research on different types of porcelain forms and methods and making. And it was really amazing to learn from my colleagues in Chinese art at LACMA about that, and other colleagues as well, and get a sense of how these things were made, how many different markets they could be for. In Jingdezhen, in the porcelain capital of China, they're making things for Japan that look quite different than what they're making for Portugal, and very different than what they're making for the emperor, right, in his court. So you have this fascinating center of making where they're meeting all these different needs, and they're doing so very expediently, and they're making a bunch of money off the Dutch, right, who are just porcelain crazed. So I think that's a fascinating story. But yeah, I also enjoyed digging into the more difficult objects, like the Frans Post painting you mentioned of Dutch Brazil. And having heard, the thoughts on that painting from a historian, Carolina Monteiro, who has worked for many, many years on enslaved people in the Dutch colony, was fascinating. Just as it was fascinating to hear from Wira, with Sodoma, the artist I just mentioned, about how they see that painting interacting with Brazilian nature, and how they see biodiversity, right? They see their local biodiversity reflected in that painting. So it was incredible to dive into those objects that we can write off as problematic and say a sentence about how they misrepresent slavery, which is all true. But then it was really cool to see how many more things we can pull out of it and how many more ways we can look at it.
It seems like a wonderful opportunity for people to come and engage and kind of put themselves in the shoes of a different time and kind of sort through some messy, thorny issues that people are still wrestling with. And again, respect how much work that it's obvious you've put into putting this show together. It's the World Made Wondrous, the Dutch Collector's Cabinet, and the Politics of Possession, September 17th of this year to March 3rd of next year at LACMA. Diva, thank you so much for sitting down and talking to me about your hard work.
And thank you for having me. It was really nice talking to
you. That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.